The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty at 11 at night, the kind of hour when the overhead lights buzzed a little too loud and the vending machines hummed like tired old men. Nurse Elena Ross sat alone at her usual corner table, a folded newspaper beside her, a small potted succulent she'd brought from home to make the sterile room feel less like a waiting area for grief. She wrapped both hands around a chipped black mug that read "Coffee, then save lives," and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle the exhaustion in her shoulders. 12 hours into a shift that had started with a cardiac arrest and ended with a pediatric trauma case, she needed exactly 60 seconds of silence before she went back out there. She closed her eyes and breathed. That was when the doors at the far end of the corridor opened, and the temperature of the room seemed to change. A man walked in wearing tactical gear that had no business being in a hospital hallway at this hour. Multicam fatigues, a plate carrier still buckled from whatever operation had just ended, a sidearm holstered but present, and dust on his boots that spoke of somewhere far rougher than this city. Behind him trailed a German shepherd in a matching canine vest, ears alert, eyes scanning, moving with the disciplined calm of an animal that had seen far more than any house pet ever should. The staff at the nurses' station froze mid-sentence. Doctors in white coats who had been chatting about discharge paperwork went silent, drawn toward the corridor like moths toward a flame they didn't understand. Whispers rippled down the hall. Nobody moved. Nobody dared ask the obvious question. What was a Navy SEAL commander doing walking into a civilian hospital at this hour, armed, with a military working dog at his side, looking like he'd stepped out of a war zone and into fluorescent light? Elena didn't look up right away. She'd worked trauma long enough to recognize the specific quiet that falls over a room when something serious has walked in. And she'd learned that meeting panic with panic never helped anyone. She finished her sip of coffee first. Only then did she lift her eyes toward the man standing at the edge of the cafeteria, watching the small crowd of gawking staff with the tired patience of someone used to being stared at for reasons that were never really about him. He walked toward her table, boots quiet despite their weight, and stopped a respectful distance away. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. His voice was low, worn at the edges. The voice of a man who had been giving orders under artillery fire for years, and now sounded almost fragile, asking permission to sit in a plastic cafeteria chair. It wasn't a line. It wasn't charm. It was a man who looked, for just a moment, like he needed somewhere ordinary to exist. Elena gestured to the empty seat across from her without hesitation. "Sure. It's usually just me and the ficus." A small joke, offered gently, the kind of thing she said to scared families in waiting rooms 100 times a year. He allowed himself the ghost of a smile, and lowered himself into the chair with the careful stiffness of a body running on adrenaline long after the adrenaline should have worn off. The dog, however, did not sit. The German shepherd moved past his handler's legs, nose low, and walked directly to Elena's side. He did not sniff cautiously the way working dogs typically approach strangers. He pressed his head against her knee, then rested his jaw against her lap, tail giving one slow, deliberate sweep against the floor. It was not the greeting of a dog meeting someone new. It was the greeting of recognition. The commander's expression shifted from exhaustion to something sharper, something almost disbelieving. "Diesel doesn't do that," he said quietly, watching his dog settle fully against the nurse's leg as if he'd found something he'd been searching for. "He doesn't warm up to strangers. Ever." He studied Elena's face now with new intensity, the tired soldier in him replaced by something more alert, more searching. The way a man looks when a memory is trying to surface through fog. "Have we met?" he asked. "Because Diesel, he only does this with one person I've ever known." Elena's hand had gone still on the dog's head. Something in her chest tightened, a memory rising uninvited, a triage tent, sand in every crevice of her gear, the sound of rotors overhead, a wounded handler bleeding out on a stretcher while a frightened, half-grown shepherd puppy held beside him, refusing to leave. She had been the field nurse who held that puppy back with one arm while working to stop the bleeding with the other, whispering to the young dog the entire time that his soldier was going to make it, that she wouldn't let him go. She hadn't thought about that night in years. She hadn't let herself. "What's his name again?" she asked carefully, though some part of her already knew the answer before he spoke it. "Diesel," the commander said. "I got him as a pup, right after my last handler. after the man who trained him didn't make it home from that mission. Diesel wouldn't bond with anyone for months. Everyone told me he was traumatized, that maybe he'd never work again. He paused, watching the dog's tail thump steadily against the floor, watching Elena's hand tremble slightly where it rested on Diesel's head. There was a nurse who was there that night. Field hospital, forward base, chaos everywhere. Nobody ever told me her name. I've wondered about her for 6 years. The cafeteria had gone entirely silent now, doctors and nurses lining the doorway, not one of them willing to break whatever was unfolding at that small corner table. Elena felt her throat tighten, felt 6 years of unanswered questions rising in her chest all at once. She looked up from the dog and met the commander's eyes fully for the first time. "I never got your name either," she said quietly. "I just remember you weren't supposed to survive the flight." The dog, sensing something enormous shifting in the air between the two humans he loved, let out a low, soft whine and pressed even closer against Elena's leg, as if trying to hold the two halves of his broken memory together in one place at last. Neither Elena nor the commander said anything else for a long moment. They simply sat there, two strangers who weren't strangers at all, while a German shepherd named Diesel finally, after 6 long years, brought them back to where they belonged. The name came out of him like something he'd been carrying for years and finally set down. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus Hale. Commander, Naval Special Warfare." He extended a hand, still faintly trembling, across the small cafeteria table. Elena took it, her own hand steadier now, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Elena Ross," she answered. "I was attached to the forward surgical team that rotated through your sector. 18 months, give or take." She looked down at Diesel, who had not moved an inch from her side, his amber eyes flicking between the two of them as though he understood every word. "I remember a medevac chopper coming in hot, a handler down, and a puppy that wouldn't stop screaming until someone let him near his soldier." Marcus let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, a place he hadn't opened in a long time. "That handler was Ray Delgado, my best friend since Beauty/S training. He didn't make it out of surgery that night. I was 2 teams over, comms down, and by the time I got word, all I knew was that Ray was gone and his dog needed a new handler, or he was going to wash out of the program entirely." He reached down and rested a hand on Diesel's back, and the dog leaned into the touch without breaking his contact with Elena. "Command paired me with him 3 weeks later. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't train, wouldn't let anyone near him except when he had to work. Every handler who worked with him said the same thing. This dog had shut down completely, and they didn't think he'd ever come back from it." Elena's eyes had gone glassy, and she made no effort to hide it. In her line of work, crying wasn't weakness. It was proof that the job hadn't hollowed you out yet. "I stayed with him almost 4 hours that night," she said. "Nobody told me to. I just couldn't leave him alone in that tent while Ray was in surgery. I kept telling him it was going to be okay, even when I didn't know if it would be. When the medevac crew finally came to move him, I remember he looked back at me like he was asking permission to go." She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, half laughing at herself. "I've thought about that dog for 6 years, wondered if he made it, wondered if he ever got better. I never imagined I'd find out sitting in a hospital cafeteria in the middle of the night." Around them, the small crowd that had gathered in stunned silence began to understand what they were witnessing, and a few of the younger nurses were openly crying, hands pressed to their mouths. The armed men who had accompanied Marcus, his security detail still standing near the doorway, had lowered their guarded postures, watching their commander with something like reverence. This was not the story anyone had expected when a fully armed SEAL commander and his K9 partner walked into a civilian ER after an emergency deployment nearby. They had expected tension, an evacuation briefing, maybe a security sweep. Instead, they were watching 6 years of grief and healing collide in a plastic cafeteria chair. "He's been my partner for 6 years now," Marcus continued, his voice thick. 11 deployments together. He's pulled 2 of my guys out of collapsed structures. He's found explosives that would have killed half my team. Everyone talks about how steady he is now, how nothing rattles him. He shook his head slowly, still trying to process what he was seeing. But he's never done this. Not once. Not with any nurse, any handler at the kennel, any of my guys. He walked straight past me and put his head in your lap like he'd been waiting 6 years to do exactly that. Diesel, as if agreeing with the assessment, let out a long sigh and rested his chin fully on Elena's knee, eyes half closing, tail still slowly sweeping the floor in contentment. Elena ran her hand along his ears, the same motion she remembered doing in that dust-choked tent so long ago, and felt something settle in her own chest that she hadn't realized was still unsettled. Maybe he never forgot, she said softly. Maybe some part of him has been looking for the person who held him together the night he thought he'd lost everything. Marcus studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing behind his eyes, gratitude, disbelief, the particular ache of a debt he never thought he'd get the chance to repay. "I owe you more than a cup of coffee," he said finally, managing a small, tired laugh. "You kept him from falling apart before I even knew he existed. If he hadn't bonded with someone that night, if you hadn't stayed, he might never have made it through training at all. Everything he's done since, every life he's helped save. Some part of that starts with you." Elena shook her head, though her smile was full now, unguarded. "He did the work. I just sat with a scared puppy for a few hours." She looked down at Diesel again, at the canine vest with police stitched across it, at the scars barely visible beneath his fur, at the calm, steady creature he had become. "Looks like he grew into someone pretty remarkable." "He did," Marcus agreed. "And so apparently did you." For a while, nobody in that cafeteria said anything at all. The doctors who had gathered drifted back to their rounds, the security detail relaxed by the doorway, and the late-night hum of the hospital resumed its familiar rhythm. But at the small corner table, a nurse, a commander, and a dog who remembered everything sat together in a silence that finally, after 6 long years, felt like peace instead of loss. Sometimes the people who save us disappear before we can thank them. And sometimes, if we're lucky enough and the world is kind enough, they walk back through the door exactly when we need them most. Led there by someone who never stopped remembering the way home. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next reunion, the next hero, the next moment that reminds us the people and the animals we help along the way have a way of finding us again. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join a community that believes in these stories as much as you do. There are so many more waiting to be told.